Let me ask you something. When was the last time a sitting prime minister of one country was formally invited to address the parliament of another, not just for a diplomatic visit, not for a photo opportunity, but to deliver what amounts to a geopolitical declaration in front of an entire legislature? Because that is exactly what just happened between Australia and Canada. And if you think this is just two friendly Commonwealth nations exchanging pleasantries, you are going to want to stay with me. Because what is happening here goes several layers deeper than the headline. This is not a diplomatic courtesy. This is a signal, a very deliberate, very carefully constructed signal sent at a moment when the global order is fracturing in real time. Here is what we know. On January 25th of this year, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese appeared on ABC's Insiders program, Australia's flagship political television program, and announced that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney would visit Australia in March and deliver an address to the Australian Parliament in Canberra. That alone is significant. But to understand why it is significant, you need to understand what happened in the 5 days before that announcement. Because the timing is not accidental. In politics, timing is almost never accidental. 5 days earlier, on January 20th, Mark Carney stood before the assembled elites of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and delivered a speech that stopped the room. And I mean that literally. He received a standing ovation at Davos. If you know anything about Davos, you know that standing ovations there are extraordinarily rare. These are people who have seen everything and are impressed by almost nothing. But what Carney said unsettled them, provoked them, and ultimately moved them in a way that is hard to dismiss as theater. He opened in French. He said, and I am translating here, that we are witnessing the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a brutal reality where great power geopolitics is submitted to no limits, no constraints. Then he switched to English, and he made it even clearer. He said, we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. A rupture, not a correction, not a recalibration, a rupture. That word choice was not accidental either. And here is the line that got quoted around the world. Middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Carney never named Donald Trump. He did not need to. The entire speech was a sustained, forensic, and diplomatically precise dissection of what happens when the most powerful country in the world decides that rules only apply to others. He talked about great powers using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He talked about the architecture of multilateral institutions, the WTO, the UN, the COP, being under direct threat. He talked about the need for middle powers to stop living within the lie of a rules-based order that the most powerful no longer respect. If you are sitting in Washington, you know exactly who he was talking about. And Donald Trump confirmed it, because the very next day at his own Davos appearance, he turned to the audience and said effectively that Canada should be grateful. Canada lives because of the United States, Trump said. Remember that, Mark, before you make your statements. This is what political confrontation looks like at the highest level, not a shouting match, a carefully calibrated exchange of signals broadcast to every government on earth that tells them where the lines are being drawn. And then, within 48 hours of Carney's speech, Donald Trump sent what can only be described as a formal diplomatic slapdown, not through a briefing, not through a press secretary, but through a public Truth Social post addressed personally to Carney. The post read, "Dear Prime Minister Carney, please let this letter serve to represent that the Board of Peace is withdrawing its invitation to you regarding Canada's joining what will be the most prestigious board of leaders ever assembled at any time." I want you to sit with that for a moment. The President of the United States publicly disinvited the Prime Minister of Canada from a diplomatic body in the style of a bad breakup letter and posted it on social media for the entire world to read. This is what diplomacy looks like in 2026. And every government in the world is watching and taking notes. Now, the Board of Peace, let's be precise about what this actually is, because the details matter enormously. Trump's Board of Peace was ostensibly created to oversee the post-war rebuilding of Gaza. But Trump himself suggested its mandate might expand, that it could ultimately rival the United Nations itself. Think about what that means structurally. The countries that showed up to sign its charter in Davos included Hungary, Belarus, Saudi Arabia, and a collection of authoritarian and semi-authoritarian governments. The countries that said no or expressed serious reservations included France, the UK, Sweden, Norway, Canada, essentially every functioning liberal democracy that still takes institutional norms seriously. Australia was invited, and Australia, as of January 25th, had still not committed to joining. Albanese's language was carefully diplomatic. We will give it further consideration, but the direction of travel was unmistakable. On the same day Albanese said that, he also announced that Mark Carney would address the Australian Parliament. These two statements, made in the same interview, have to be read together. Australia was telling the world, we are not reflexively joining Trump's new parallel international architecture. We are instead deepening ties with the country that just publicly challenged it. And here is where it gets even more consequential, because there is another piece of this story that has been somewhat underreported in the Western press, and it concerns a moment of genuine moral clarity. In that same Fox News interview at Davos, Trump made a claim about NATO's role in Afghanistan that drew immediate and furious condemnation from allies across the world. He said essentially that NATO troops in Afghanistan stayed a little back, a little off the front lines, that they were never really needed, that America had never needed them. He questioned whether NATO allies would be there if America needed them. These remarks were not just diplomatically careless, they were factually false. More than 3,000 NATO troops from non-American countries died in Afghanistan. The United Kingdom lost 457 service personnel. Canada lost 165. Denmark had the highest per capita death toll of any coalition force. Australia is not a NATO member, but Australia sent 40,000 troops to Afghanistan over 20 years. 47 of them came home in flag-draped coffins. When Anthony Albanese was asked about this on Australian television, he did not pivot, he did not hedge, and he did not soften. He said Trump's remarks were completely unacceptable. He said those 47 Australian families who will be hurting by these comments, they deserve our absolute respect. He said Australian troops were certainly on the front lines. He called Trump's characterization of their service entirely not appropriate. That language from a leader who had up to that point been carefully diplomatic about not criticizing Trump directly, that was a shift, a meaningful one. So now you have the full picture of what happened in one extraordinary week. Carney delivers a speech at Davos that is widely understood as the most substantive public challenge to Trumpian unilateralism from any Western leader since Trump's second term began. Trump publicly disinvites him from his new international body and tells him Canada only exists because of America. Trump then insults the war dead of nearly every NATO ally on Earth. And 5 days later, Anthony Albanese announces that Carney will address the Australian Parliament, a privilege extended to very few foreign leaders, and simultaneously declines to commit to Trump's Board of Peace. This is not coincidence. This is diplomacy in motion. Now I want to step back from the sequence of events and talk about what this actually means strategically, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely important and where I think most coverage has failed to go far enough. Australia's position in the global order is extraordinarily complex. It is a close US ally, perhaps the closest outside of the UK. AUKUS, the trilateral security arrangement between Australia, the UK, and the United States, is a cornerstone of Australian strategic defense. The AUKUS deal is designed to give Australia nuclear-powered submarines, a decades-long, multi-hundred billion-dollar commitment, and it depends entirely on American industrial capacity and political will to execute. If the United States pulls back, or if the relationship sours, that entire framework is at risk. At the same time, Australia's largest trading partner is China. Its economic interests and its security commitments point in fundamentally different directions. And now, the country managing the relationship at the top, the United States, has become increasingly unpredictable in ways that force Australia to consider hedging strategies it would never have entertained a decade ago. This is precisely the strategic calculation that Carney named at Davos. He was not just speaking about Canada. He was speaking to every middle power caught between great powers they cannot control. And when Albanese said on television, "I agree with him," he was signaling something significant, not just personal alignment, but a reconsideration of strategic assumptions. The concept of middle powers acting together is not new in international relations theory, but what is new is the urgency. And what Carney's speech did, and what the Australian parliamentary invitation amplifies, is give that concept a concrete institutional expression. Two middle powers both members of the Commonwealth, both Five Eyes intelligence sharing partners, both heavily integrated into the US-led security architecture, are publicly declaring that they see the same problem and intend to confront it together. That is a real development, not revolutionary, but real. And there is something else worth noting, something that gives this story a longer timeline than just the last few weeks. In October of 2025, Australia and Canada signed a bilateral agreement on critical minerals. They committed to cooperation on supply chains, energy transition, and trade. That agreement was not headline news at the time, but in retrospect, it is part of the same emerging architecture, two middle powers quietly building the economic and strategic connective tissue that Carney described at Davos. The parliamentary address is not the beginning of this relationship. It is the most visible moment in a process that has been building for months. And critically, it follows a broader pattern across other democratic governments. Carney's Davos speech drew explicit praise from leaders across Europe. The speech has been described in one prominent analysis as the eulogy for the rules-based international order as it was known, a frank admission that the comfortable fiction of universal rule following had finally become unsustainable. France's Macron rejected Trump's Board of Peace outright. The United Kingdom, under Starmer, publicly called Trump's Afghanistan remarks insulting and frankly appalling, and suggested an apology was warranted. These are not minor diplomatic frictions. This is a structural realignment, slow, imperfect, and incomplete, but real. Now, here is the part that I think deserves the most careful consideration. What does this mean for the United States? The United States remains, by any objective measure, the most powerful country on earth. Its military is unmatched. Its economy is the largest in the world. Its currency is still the global reserve currency. None of that changes overnight, and it would be a mistake, analytically and strategically, to overstate what a parliamentary invitation in Canberra means for American power. But here is the thing that Carney got exactly right in his speech, and this is where his background as a central banker and economist matters, because this is not just political rhetoric, this is a structural insight. He said, hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. What that means translated is this: the value of American power has historically rested not just on its size, but on its reliability. Allies accepted American leadership, accepted asymmetric trade relationships, accepted costs and constraints because they believed the system delivered predictability. When that predictability evaporates, when allies feel they cannot count on America to honor its commitments, or even to speak respectfully about their war dead, they start doing the math differently. They start building alternatives, not to replace the US. They do not have that option, but to reduce their exposure to American unpredictability. And that is a slow but compounding process that ultimately does diminish American influence, not through confrontation, but through drift. Carney called this risk management. He said the cost of strategic autonomy can be shared. That is the project now underway. Australia, Canada, Canada, China, Australia, UK. the EU building its own frameworks. It is a gradual construction of resilience, not against America per se, but against the possibility that America will be unreliable